All right, so France.
Yep.
Looks like you've been hitting the books.
A little bit.
A little bit, more like a lot. You sent over a whole stack of stuff, news articles, even some personal notes. Wow. Clearly, you've got France on the brain. What is it that's really got you curious? What's making you want to hit that research button?
I think it's just that feeling that things are shifting there,
Hmm.
you know? It's always interesting, but it feels like France is at a turning point.
Okay. I like that. I like that. A
Yeah.
turning point. Yeah.
Yeah. And you see all these interconnected shifts like immigration, economy, even wealth distribution. They're all kind of tangled up, almost like a
Wait.
four-dimensional knot.
Oh, four-dimensional knot. Okay, I'm intrigued. So let's try and untangle this knot, shall we?
Yeah.
And it seems like one of the big threads we got to pull on is immigration. Your sources definitely point to that as a major flashpoint right now.
Yeah, for sure. France has always been a destination for immigrants, but the current situation is just, it's particularly complex. I mean, you've got this surge in asylum seekers, and then at the same time, the EU is tightening its borders.
Right.
So it's putting this immense pressure on the system.
Yeah, it's a lot, and it's creating a lot of tension within French society, too.
Totally.
And I think that source you sent about the recent protests in Paris really brings that tension to life. It's not just policy debates happening in some back room somewhere. It's people, real people, taking to the streets demanding more humane immigration policies.
Right. It's very much on the ground. And there are such strongly contrasting views even within the French parliament.
Oh, yeah. Like what?
Well, you see, for example, you've got the center-right Republicans who are calling for tighter immigration quotas and stricter border controls.
Mm.
But then you have the Socialist Party, more on the left, and they're pushing for a more welcoming approach, trying to make a pathway to citizenship for asylum seekers.
Wow, so you've got these really different ideas about what it means to be French, clashing head on with this very real humanitarian crisis. No wonder people are fired up.
It's a highly charged situation, definitely. And it all feeds into the economic anxieties that people are feeling, anxieties that a lot of French citizens are feeling.
Yeah, that makes sense. And speaking of the economy, your sources paint a bit of a mixed picture there, don't they?
Yeah.
On one hand, you've got this boom in tourism, which is fantastic. But on the other hand, you've got inflation squeezing everyone.
It really is a mixed bag at the moment. Tourism is bouncing back in a big way from the pandemic, which is, huge for the economy.
It is.
But at the same time, you're right, inflation is hitting hard. And it's hitting lower and middle income families especially hard. And it's all happening while the government is making some pretty big spending decisions.
Right. And you pointed to their focus on climate initiatives and military spending, both of which are very costly.
Yeah, and those investments are being made while there are all these debates going on about social welfare programs.
Yeah.
So it really begs the question, are these the right trade-offs? Are they prioritizing the future at the expense of the present?
That's a big question.
Yeah, it is. It's a really tough question.
Yeah.
And the answers are going to have big ripple effects for years to come, that's for sure.
Definitely. I can imagine that's weighing on people's minds, especially when you consider the uptick in unemployment that you highlighted in one of those sources.
Yeah, it's concerning. France had been making progress on that front. The unemployment rate was going down. But lately, it started to creep back up, and it's young people who are getting hit the hardest.
That's tough. Why is that happening?
A lot of it is being driven by automation and just global shifts in industries like tech and manufacturing. Skills that were really in demand a few years ago, they're not so much anymore.
It's like the rug is being pulled out from under them. But your research also talked about some government programs to try and address this, Russ.
Yeah, the government is really putting a lot of emphasis on what they're calling upskilling programs, especially for younger people and those in sectors that have been hit hard by these changes.
Okay, upskilling. So what does that mean?
Essentially, it's about providing training and education to help people adapt to this new job market.
So kind of like saying, look, we know the landscape is changing, but we're going to give you the tools to navigate it. But realistically, can everyone transition that easily?
Well, that's the million-euro question, isn't it? Not everyone can make that pivot quickly and easily. And the frustration is definitely there, especially among young people who are just trying to, get their footing, build a career, and feel secure about their future.
It's a lot of pressure, and it kind of ties into this bigger issue that one of your sources brought up, wealth inequality.
Yeah, that's a big one. France, unfortunately, has one of the highest levels of wealth inequality in Europe. And the gap is, well, it's only getting bigger.
That's not good.
No, it's not. And, all the things we've been talking about, immigration, the economy, unemployment, they all play a part in how wealth is actually distributed and who benefits the most.
It's all interconnected, and it sounds like there's a growing debate in France about how to actually address this, especially with this whole wealth tax controversy.
Oh, absolutely. There's this increasing pressure to raise taxes on the super rich. The idea being that it'll fund social programs and help alleviate some of the strain on everyday people. But as you can imagine, there's a lot of pushback on that, a lot of resistance.
Yeah, from the super rich, probably.
Well, yeah, they argue that it's going to discourage investment and that ultimately it will harm the economy in the long run.
So it's a classic standoff then. But it's not just happening in some abstract political sphere. This is about real lives, real people being impacted. I mean, it makes you wonder, what must it be like for a young person in France right now facing a future where the gap between rich and poor is just getting wider and wider?
Especially when you consider that on top of everything else, they're inheriting the consequences of climate change and all this global instability.
Oh, man. That's a lot. We've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
I think we need to take a breath, and then we'll dive deeper into some of these fascinating details from your sources.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
One thing that really struck me, going through these articles you sent, is how the immigration debate, it's about more than just numbers.
It's about identity, right?
Exactly. Exactly. Like, what does it even mean to be French? And how are these demographic shifts impacting French culture and society? And there are such strong feelings on both sides.
Yeah.
Some people really believe that France needs to protect its traditional values, its traditional way of life.
And then there are others who see immigration as a source of strength, bringing in all these new perspectives, new energy.
Right, right. And you see this clash of perspectives playing out in the political arena, too.
Yeah.
That source you sent about the recent parliamentary debates was fascinating. You can really see how divided the country is.
Yeah, it's striking. I was especially struck by, what was her name? Marine Le Pen
Oh, yes.
of the National Rally. Her stance on immigration, really limiting immigration to preserve French identity, it seemed to resonate with a lot of people.
Yeah, it did. And then on the other side of the spectrum, you have figures like Jean-Luc Mélenchon from La France Insoumise, who's arguing for more open borders, a much more welcoming
It's
approach.
just like two completely different visions for the future of France.
It really is. And it's such a complex issue. It's made even more complex by how closely it's tied to the economic anxieties we were talking about earlier.
Oh, for sure.
Some people see immigrants as competition for jobs and resources, which just fuels that resentment and division.
It's a vicious cycle. Like, economic uncertainty leads to more anti-immigrant sentiment, which then makes it harder to actually address the root causes of the economic problems.
Exactly, exactly. And, it's important to point out this isn't just happening in France. This is a global phenomenon.
Right.
We're seeing these same dynamics in lots of different countries, especially those struggling with their economies.
Makes you wonder, what's going on in the world, right? Okay, so back to France. Let's talk more about their economic challenges. You mentioned that tourism is a bright spot. What's driving that growth?
Well, I mean, France has always been a top tourist destination, right? I mean, you have the Eiffel Tower, the Louvre, these iconic landmarks that draw people from all over the world.
And the food and the wine. I mean, let's not forget that.
Oh, of course, the food and wine, absolutely. But they've also been really strategic. They've really capitalized on that post-pandemic travel surge with targeted marketing campaigns, things like that.
Smart.
And they've also invested in improving infrastructure, making it easier for tourists to get around, to experience the country.
So they're playing to their strengths and adapting to the changing market.
Exactly. But while tourism is booming, there are definitely other sectors that are struggling. Like we were talking about the tech industry, manufacturing.
And one of your sources pointed to automation as a major factor there.
Yeah, automation is a real game changer. As technology advances, machines are doing more and more jobs that humans used to do.
It's crazy. I remember reading about this car factory. It might have been in one of your sources. I can't remember, but they replaced almost all of their human workers with robots.
It's a pretty stark example of what's happening.
Yeah.
And it's not just jobs going overseas anymore. It's jobs disappearing altogether.
Which makes the government's focus on those upskilling programs even more crucial, I guess.
Oh, absolutely. They're trying to, equip people with the skills to thrive in this new economy, this tech-driven economy. But even with all that, even with those programs, there's a real question about whether there will be enough jobs for everyone in the future.
Yeah, what happens then? It's kind of a scary thought. It makes you think about the future of work.
It really does. It's a big question. If machines can do more and more of the work that humans do, what does that mean for us? What does it mean for our sense of purpose, our place in society?
Deep. Okay, so we've got immigration, the economy, automation, and it all kind of contributes to this feeling of uncertainty and unease in France. But where does wealth inequality fit into this picture?
Well, as we mentioned earlier, the wealth gap in France is significant, and it's been getting wider.
Yeah.
And, this disparity, it contributes to social tensions.
Yeah, for sure.
People feel like the system is rigged against them, that the deck is stacked.
Totally. And you mentioned that there's growing pressure to address this through a wealth tax.
Right. The idea is if you tax the super rich, then you can use that money to fund essential programs, redistribute the wealth a little bit.
Okay, but there must be people against that.
Oh, there are, definitely.
Yeah.
The opponents of a wealth tax argue that it's going to discourage investment, drive away wealthy individuals and businesses, and just ultimately harm the economy.
So it comes down to this fundamental debate about the role of government and finding that balance between economic freedom and social responsibility.
Exactly. And it's a debate that's happening all over the world, not just in France. Like, how do we create a system that is fair and prosperous, that provides opportunity for everyone, but also rewards hard work and innovation? It's a tough question.
It is a tough question. But one thing that's clear from your research is that young people in France aren't waiting for the older generation to figure it out. They're not just sitting around.
Yeah, they're not. They're taking action, demanding change. They're organizing protests, starting movements online, and they're pushing for some pretty innovative solutions, like universal basic income.
Yeah, what about that? One of your sources mentioned that as a potential solution to these challenges, like automation, providing a safety net for people.
Right. The idea with universal basic income is that everyone gets a regular payment from the government, no matter what, whether they have a job or not.
Yeah,
It's definitely a radical idea,
it is.
but it's gaining traction as a possible solution to the economic realities of the 21st century.
It's interesting to see these new ideas bubbling up. Almost feels like we're on the verge of some major societal shift.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And it's being driven by this younger generation, their energy, their idealism.
Mm-hmm.
They're not content with the status quo. They want a more just and equitable and sustainable future.
Yeah, they're fired up. Their passion is pretty inspiring, actually. But with all these complex challenges and all these competing perspectives, I mean, where do you see France heading? Is there any reason to be optimistic about the future?
I think there's reason to be optimistic. I mean, it does feel like France is at a crossroads, like we were saying, like they're facing all these different paths. But one thing that your research really highlights, it keeps coming up over and over again, is this idea of resilience.
Resilience, yeah.
Like France has this history of overcoming challenges,
Uh,
reinventing itself.
they've been through a lot.
They have revolutions, wars, economic crises. I mean, they've seen it all.
Mm.
And they always seem to come out stronger on the other side. There's this tenacity, refusal to give up. It's kind of in the French spirit.
And it feels like that spirit is alive and well in this younger generation.
Yeah.
They're not just complaining, they're actually trying to shape the conversation.
Yeah, they're demanding action, pushing for real change. They want a more inclusive, equitable, sustainable future.
It's inspiring, really.
It is. And their willingness to challenge the status quo, proposing these bold solutions like universal basic income.
Yeah.
It's remarkable. I mean,
Yeah.
whether or not those specific policies are implemented, you got to admire their energy, their activism. It's injecting this sense of urgency into these really important debates.
Yeah, it's like they're saying we're not just going to inherit the problems of the past, we're going to create a better future.
Exactly.
I love that. And it's important to remember that what happens in France doesn't stay in France.
Oh,
It has ripple effects throughout Europe, throughout the world. So the choices they make in the next few years, a lot of people are going to be watching very closely.
Mm.
So we've talked about the challenges, the anxieties, all the clashing viewpoints. But amidst all of that, are there any bright spots that you see? Any areas where you feel optimistic about France's future?
Well, one area that gives me hope is their commitment to the green economy. I mean, they're really investing in renewable energy, sustainable development, green technologies.
Yeah.
And that's not just good for the environment. It has the potential to create jobs, boost the economy.
Yeah.
It could position France as a leader in this global transition to a more sustainable future.
Okay, so a potential win-win-win. That's great. What about on the social front? Any signs of progress there?
I think so. The fact that there's this growing awareness of wealth inequality and there are more and more people calling for social justice,
Yeah.
I think that's creating some real momentum. The younger generation especially, they're really pushing for a more equitable society. They're not afraid to challenge the status quo.
They're not messing around.
No, they're not. Whether it's through protests, online activism, policy proposals, they're making their voices heard. They want a fairer system. They're demanding it.
Good for them.
Yeah.
It almost sounds like France is going through this national soul-searching, grappling with some really fundamental questions about their identity, their values, their vision for the future.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. And it's a healthy process, even though it can be messy and challenging. It's how societies evolve. The key is to approach it with an open mind, a willingness to listen to different perspectives. You have to be committed to finding solutions that actually work for everyone.
Very well said. So to our listener who sent in all this amazing research on France, we hope this deep dive has given you a better, more nuanced understanding of the complexities and also the possibilities that France is facing.
It's a country at a crossroads, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Facing challenges, yes, but also full of potential for positive change.
It's exciting. And for everyone else listening, I think there are some really valuable lessons we can all learn from France's experience. It's a reminder that even when things feel uncertain, even when there's division, there's always hope.
Always room for progress.
And ultimately, the future is something we create together.
Well said.
So thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the heart of France. And keep exploring these topics, engage in those thoughtful discussions, and never stop asking questions. Because ultimately, that's how we learn, that's how we grow, and that's how we build a better world for everyone.